In 2024, Nvidia controlled 95% of China's entire AI chip market. Every major Chinese tech company, Alibaba, ByteDance, and Baidu, was running on Nvidia hardware. Jensen Huang, Nvidia's chief executive officer, was being treated like a rock star every time he visited Beijing. The company was printing money. Then the US government banned the chips. And instead of collapsing, China did something nobody in Silicon Valley saw coming. They didn't find a workaround. They didn't smuggle the chips. They built something better. And by May 2026, Jensen Huang stood in front of investors and said 7 words that should have made every American uncomfortable. In China, we have now dropped to 0. Here is the part nobody is reporting. Nvidia didn't lose China because of the ban. Nvidia lost China because China stopped needing Nvidia. Those are two completely different things, and the difference between them is worth about $50 billion a year. Nvidia's total revenue in the past 4 quarters crossed $80 billion. China was historically 12.5% of that number. Sometimes as high as 20 to 25% of their entire data center business. That is not a side market. That is a foundational revenue stream that has now gone to 0. $2.5 billion lost in the first quarter of 2025 alone. An additional $8 billion in projected loss in the second quarter. Jensen Huang himself told analysts on an earnings call, the $50 billion China market is effectively closed to US industry. Not slowing down. Not shrinking. Closed. To understand how radical this is, consider what Nvidia's H100 chip actually costs to run. A single H100 chip consumes roughly 700 watts of power. A data center running 10,000 of them, which is a modest AI training cluster by today's standards, draws 7 megawatts of electricity continuously. That is enough power for a small city. The cooling infrastructure alone to keep those chips from melting costs upward of $10 million to build before a single calculation is run. Microsoft, Google, and Amazon are spending billions of dollars building new power plants and even negotiating nuclear energy deals specifically because Nvidia's chips are so power hungry. LightGen changes that equation at the physics level. Photons carry information without generating the heat that electrons produce. You do not need a swimming pool of coolant beneath your data center. You do not need a dedicated power station outside it. The operating cost of running AI at LightGen's efficiency level is not 10% lower than Nvidia. It is structurally, fundamentally different. In the same way that an electric car's fuel cost is structurally different from a petrol engine's, not just marginally cheaper. In December 2025, a paper was published in the journal Science. Not a tech blog. Not a press release. Science, one of the most respected peer-reviewed journals on the planet. The paper described a chip called LightGen, developed by a joint team from Shanghai Jiao Tong University and Tsinghua University. And the number buried inside that paper should have crashed Nvidia's stock the moment it was published. LightGen outperformed Nvidia's A100 chip by more than 100 times in both speed and energy efficiency for specific AI workloads. Not 10% faster, not twice as fast, 100 times. Here is what makes LightGen fundamentally different from every chip that came before it. Nvidia's chips, every graphics processing unit ever built, move information using electrons. Electrons are fast, but they generate heat, they consume enormous amounts of power, and they have a hard physical limit on how fast they can travel through a silicon circuit. LightGen doesn't use electrons. It uses photons. The chip processes information at the speed of light, literally, because that is what light does. It moves at 299,000 792 kilometers per second. No electron can compete with that. The chip packs over 2 million artificial photonic neurons into a space smaller than your thumbnail, 136.5 square millimeters. Previous photonic chips had only a few thousand neurons, nowhere near enough for real AI tasks. LightGen crossed the threshold that makes complex AI generation possible. High-resolution images, 3-dimensional scenes, video, all processed through light bouncing between photonic components instead of electrons crawling through silicon wires. And here is the second Chinese chip they are not telling you about. At the same time, LightGen was being developed at Shanghai Jiaotong. A separate team at Tsinghua University was building something called Excel, a hybrid chip that combines photonic computing with analog electronics. Excel delivers 4.6 petaflops of performance, meaning if you lined up Nvidia's best chip against China's Excel in a straight race, China's chip wins. Not by a photo finish, by a full second when Nvidia is still crossing the starting line. China built 2 separate chips from 2 separate universities, both outperforming Nvidia's best hardware, published in the same research window. That is not a coincidence. That is a coordinated national push. While the photonic story was developing in university labs, China's largest tech company was running its own war on a different front. Huawei. By 2025, Huawei planned to produce 600,000 units of its Ascend 910C AI chip, doubling its previous output. By 2026, Huawei's entire Ascend chip line is targeting 1.6 million dies. These are not photonic chips. These are conventional silicon chips designed to do exactly what the H100 does: train and run large AI models at scale. And they are getting better fast. DeepSeek, the Chinese AI company that shocked Silicon Valley in January 2025, trained its R1 model on approximately 2,000 Nvidia H800 chips for just $5.6 million. The same model would have cost OpenAI an estimated $100 million on their standard infrastructure. China learned to do more with less, and now they are building them more domestically. The scale of what Huawei is building deserves its own moment. The Ascend 910C is not just a chip, it is the centerpiece of an entire AI computing ecosystem Huawei is assembling to replace Nvidia's stack from the ground up. Huawei has developed its own AI training framework called MindSpore. Its own interconnect system to link thousands of chips together the way Nvidia's NVLink does, and its own superpod infrastructure. Essentially a self-contained AI data center that Chinese companies can deploy without touching a single American component. Alibaba, Baidu, and ByteDance, companies that were ordering billions of dollars of Nvidia hardware as recently as 2024, are now running pilots on Huawei's Ascend infrastructure. Not because they want to out of loyalty, because Washington made the alternative illegal. And Goldman Sachs analysts have noted something important. Chinese AI companies are no longer complaining about the performance gap between Huawei's chips and Nvidia's. They are closing it fast enough that the gap has stopped being a strategic concern. Now here is the part that nobody in the American tech press wants to say out loud. The US export ban, the ban that was supposed to slow China down, may have been the single greatest gift America ever gave to the Chinese chip industry. Think about what happened. Before the ban, Chinese companies were buying Nvidia chips because they were the best and easiest option. After the ban, they had no choice but to build their own. And when you have no choice, you build fast. Goldman Sachs forecasts Cambricon, one of China's domestic AI chip makers, will see revenue grow 3.7 times in the coming years. Huawei extracted from Beijing what Nvidia extracted from Washington, a captive domestic customer base secured by regulation. Every Chinese AI company that used to write Nvidia a check is now writing that check to a Chinese company instead. Washington has not been sitting still. The escalation has been relentless, and it has moved in both directions. In October 2022, the Biden administration imposed the first major export controls, banning Nvidia's A100 and H100 from China. Nvidia responded by designing modified chips, the A800 and H800, built specifically to stay just below the export threshold. China bought millions of them. Washington banned those too. Nvidia designed the H20. China ordered $4.6 billion worth before that was banned as well. In April 2025, the Commerce Department declared the H20 non-compliant with export controls. Nvidia took a $5.5 billion write-off overnight. In January 2026, President Trump signed a national security proclamation imposing a 25% duty on Nvidia's H200 chips bound for China. By May 2026, Nvidia's China market share had fallen from 95% to what Jensen Huang described as effectively zero. Every restriction created a window. China used every window to build faster. But here is what makes this story genuinely alarming for American national security planners, and it has nothing to do with commerce. In November 2025, the Department of Justice indicted 3 individuals linked to a U.S. technology supplier for allegedly diverting roughly $2.5 billion worth of Nvidia-equipped servers to China. Not through official channels, through dummy server audits and Southeast Asian shell companies. While Washington was banning chips through the front door, $2.5 billion in Nvidia hardware was walking in through the back. And those chips, the ones China was never supposed to have, were being used to train the exact AI models that are now competing with American systems. The ban created a black market. The black market gave China the bridge it needed while its own chips caught up. The impact of this chip war has spread far beyond China and the United States. The global AI chip market was valued at somewhere between $23 billion and $123 billion in 2024. A wide range that reflects how fast the sector is moving and how difficult it is to measure. By 2030, it is projected to reach $154 billion, growing at a compound annual rate of roughly 20%. Europe is watching this conflict and accelerating its own semiconductor sovereignty initiatives. Japan and South Korea, both home to critical chip manufacturing infrastructure, are being pulled between their U.S. alliances and their deep economic ties with China. TSMC in Taiwan, which manufactures chips for both Nvidia and some Chinese clients, is under pressure from Washington to completely cut off any indirect supply chains that might benefit Chinese AI development. The entire global semiconductor supply chain is being reorganized around a single question: whose chips are you allowed to use? And here is why this matters to you directly. The phone in your pocket, the laptop on your desk, the car in your driveway, all of them contain chips manufactured somewhere in this supply chain. When that chain reorganizes, the price you pay and the technology you get access to changes with it. A world where Chinese chips dominate does not just mean American companies lose revenue. It means the devices billions of people use every day are built on a foundation that Washington no longer controls. That is not a trade story. That is a national security story wearing a business suit. And here is the angle that every channel covering this story is missing. China's photonic chip breakthrough, LightGen, is not just a faster chip. It solves a problem that has been strangling the entire AI industry globally, not just in China. A single data center running thousands of H100 chips needs a cooling infrastructure that can cost $10 million or more to build. just for the cooling. That is before you pay for the electricity, which for large AI training runs can cost millions of dollars per month. LightGen runs on light. Photons generate almost no heat compared to electrons. The power consumption difference is not marginal. It is structural. If photonic chips scale to general-purpose AI workloads, the economics of running AI change completely. Not just for China, but for every company on Earth currently paying Nvidia $30,000 to $40,000 per chip to train their models. Now here is what this channel will tell you that most others will not. LightGen and Accel are not replacing Nvidia's H100 tomorrow. The researchers themselves are honest about this. These photonic chips are currently specialized. They perform extraordinarily well on specific generative AI tasks like image synthesis and video generation. They are not yet general-purpose processors. Nvidia's CUDA software ecosystem, built over 15 years and used by millions of developers, gives Nvidia a software advantage that no single chip can instantly cross. And Huawei's Ascend chips, while improving rapidly, still face yield and manufacturing challenges that limit how quickly they can scale to meet China's full domestic demand. What is happening is not an overnight collapse of Nvidia. What is happening is a structural shift that will take 5 to 10 years to fully play out. And China has just demonstrated it is running that race faster than anyone expected. But here is the final number that puts everything in perspective. Nvidia's chief executive officer, Jensen Huang, a man who rarely says anything negative about his own business in public, said this on an earnings call in 2025, the US export restrictions have already largely backfired. The chief executive of the most valuable chip company in the world, a company worth over $3 trillion at its peak, is saying publicly that the US government's own policy is hurting American industry more than it is hurting China. Brookings Institution researchers described it as the point of no return for US chipmakers in China. A market that Nvidia once owned 95% of is now being served entirely by domestic Chinese alternatives. And those alternatives, photonic chips running on light, Ascend chips scaling to 1.6 million dies, AI models trained for $5.6 million instead of $100 million, are no longer just catching up. In specific areas, they have already arrived, and the financial damage to Nvidia is not abstract. In the first quarter of 2025, Nvidia lost $2.5 billion in China revenue in a single quarter. The H20 chip, specifically engineered to comply with US export rules, generating $4.6 billion in orders before restrictions tightened, dropped to zero sales to Chinese customers by mid-2025. Nvidia took a $5.5 billion write-off overnight when the Commerce Department declared even the H20 non-compliant. A Bernstein research estimate projects Nvidia's share of China's AI chip market could fall from 66% in 2024 to roughly 8% in coming years. And that 8% assumes the restrictions don't tighten further. They have tightened at every step so far. Meanwhile, the companies that used to be Nvidia's biggest Chinese customers, Alibaba, ByteDance, Baidu, are not sitting idle. They are building on Huawei's Ascend infrastructure, running pilots on domestic systems, and in some cases developing their own in-house silicon. The customer base Nvidia spent a decade cultivating in China is not waiting for the ban to lift. It is moving on permanently. This was never really a story about one chip company or one export ban. It is a story about what happens when you try to slow down a country's technological development by cutting off its supply chain. Sometimes it works. And sometimes, as is increasingly clear in the case of AI chips, it accelerates exactly what you are trying to prevent. History has a precedent for this. In the early 2000s, US payment card companies like Visa and MasterCard were blocked from operating inside China. At the time, China's domestic payment network was inferior. Rather than accept that, Chinese authorities used the exclusion to build China UnionPay from scratch. Today, UnionPay processes more transactions globally than Visa and MasterCard combined. The chip story is following the same arc, just faster, and with higher stakes. China did not build LightGen because it wanted to. China built LightGen because America left it no other choice. And the chip it built in that moment of necessity outperforms Nvidia's best hardware by a factor of 100 on the workloads that matter most to the future of artificial intelligence. The $50 billion empire is not dead, but for the first time in the history of the AI industry, there is a credible alternative, and it was made in China. If stories like this about the hidden shifts underneath the technology headlines are what you come here for, subscribe and turn on notifications. These developments move fast, and most of the coverage misses the real story underneath. Now here is what I want you to answer in the comments. Jensen Huang says, the export ban has backfired. Do you agree? Did America's chip ban end up helping China more than hurting it? Drop your answer below. I read every single one.